I'm going to teach you how to stop spinning out when you try to drift in Assetto Corsa. And because Assetto is a realistic simulator, these tips will also apply if you're trying to learn how to drift in real life. I'm Ben, and I've been drifting my 240SX for over 10 years. I've even drifted it in Japan. And this video contains my best advice around how to reduce spinouts condensed down into one tutorial video. Welcome to Kame Trick. It's the channel that bridges the gap between sim and real life drifting, and we're starting right now. Here we are in my car of choice. It's the WDT Street S13 Silvia, and I'm using the stock tune. A lot of people, I think, when they experience difficulty with spinning on transition, try to fix it with tuning, and unfortunately, it's usually not a tuning issue with these drift cars, especially the WDT pack. It's usually a driver issue, but don't worry, we'll get through that right now. So we're gonna hop into the car. We're at the clutch kickers track because it's a fairly simple track. The corners are fairly low speed, and most importantly, the corners are, except for the entry here, basically the same speed. You don't have a whole lot of speed change, and that is what you want for getting the hang of transitions. So, in a nutshell, we're going to talk about the 3 phases of drifting real quick. This is just my opinion. This is how I characterize it. First of all, you've got to initiate the drift. You're going to give an input so strong that it puts the car into a slide or a spin. Second, you're going to catch the drift. This is where you're going to do something with your countersteer and your throttle to let the rear of the car start to grip up. It's going to stop spinning out at like 45 degrees of angle, for example, part way sideways. Then, once you have caught the drift, you're going to maintain it. And so you're going to roll back into throttle at that point, and you're going to essentially use a combination of throttle and countersteer to hold the car in drift. So we can demonstrate that real quick. We're in second gear. So we're going to give it a clutch kick and see how the car goes sideways, and then we come off throttle for a minute. That's really the key. This is demonstrating the first 2 steps. The first one is, of course, making the car go sideways, and that's really basic. There's a little bit of a sliding scale you need to think about. If your input is too weak, the car won't go sideways. See how the car kind of fell on its face? Because my clutch kick was lightning fast. It didn't actually build up any real charge to kick. And then on the other hand, if your clutch kick is huge, it's going to be really hard. Of course, I didn't try to countersteer because I'm trying to make a point. But if you're spinning on the entry or initiation phase, it could be that you're giving it too much weight shift. So balance that. If you're spinning, do a weaker weight shift. If you're not getting sideways enough, do a stronger one, a longer one, or countersteer less. And then we're going to get into catching the drift, that second phase. What it's going to look like is the car is going to get sideways, and then it's going to stop. You see how it's picking up angle, and then it slows down, and then it grips up? We're talking about the degree of angle change, the yaw angle if you're into piloting terms. But that means you've caught the drift. You need to practice being able to do this. If your steering is not enough, you may find that you slowly spin the car. If your throttle input is too powerful, you may find that you slowly spin the car. Envision in your mind that there is a mechanical link between the steering wheel and the throttle. And if you give the car more throttle, you're going to need to give it probably more steering angle to balance that throttle. If you let off the throttle all of a sudden, assuming that you're not trying to change directions, you're going to need to dial back some of your countersteer and bring the wheel closer to centered again so that it balances the car in that slide. If you find that the car is spinning when you're trying to initiate, then either you're not countersteering enough, or you're countersteering too late, or you're staying on power too long. On the other hand, if the car isn't going into a drift, you could be countersteering too soon, you could be getting off the throttle too soon, or you could be giving it a really weak weight shift. Also, as a point of fact, if the car is out of RPM, it's really hard to start drifting because drifting is reliant on the tires being able to spin faster than the car is actually traveling down the road. So if we're on red line and I turn in, the car is understeering. If I were to do that in second gear, or when the car still had RPMs to work with, it would not have understeered. It would have gone into a spin. So keep that in mind as well. if you are trying to do a big entry and you're near the top of your RPM and you do a clutch kick, nothing may happen if you hit the rev limiter. Now that we've covered initiating, catching the drift, and maintaining the drift with a mix of throttle and countersteer, we're going to talk about how to change directions. You've got two basic options. There are more than this, but again, we're covering the basics to help you guys who are having trouble with spinning. You can either give less throttle and keep roughly the same amount of steering angle, so we'll try that up here. You see I come off the throttle and then I catch the drift, or you can use the same amount of throttle, but you can add more steering angle. So I'm not moving my foot, but I'm going to go bop, bop. And even though I never adjusted my throttle position, I was able to use the steering to pull the car around in different directions. Essentially, what is happening here, if you are using the throttle method, when you let your foot off the throttle, the rear tires start to slow down because they're dragging against the ground. They start to gain more traction the slower that they're spinning. Eventually, when the speed that they're spinning matches the speed that the car is moving across the concrete, they're going to achieve grip. At the same time, weight is transitioning forward, just like when you hit the brakes and you get pushed forward in your seat. And you haven't changed your steering, so you're still, in this case, steering over here. All that causes the front tires to dig in and pull the car around, and that's going to cause the car to initiate a drift. It's going to cause the car to want to spin out in this direction. Then all that you have to do is catch the drift, just like before, and let the wheel counter steer, do your thing, and catch it over here, and then roll back into throttle once the car is stable. Modulate the drift, and off you go. In a similar fashion, but slightly different, if you are in drift and you are on throttle, and you're giving the same amount of throttle, you can also steer in more. And what that's going to do is the car is stable. It's going around this way. We've got the front wheels facing out like this. When you steer in more, that is, again, it's going to cause, instead of letting the rear grip up, it's going to let your front traction bite, and that's going to throw the car into a slide. So in that case, the rear tires may never achieve traction like they do when you let off throttle, but it's going to cause the car, if you have the front traction to do it, and you typically do in a good drift car, it's going to whip the car around. Either way, once you do that initiation, even though it's not like an initiation from grip, it's an initiation into drift, you are going to be able to catch the drift just like you always do, modulate the drift after that just like you always do, and then either transition again at the next turn or, exit the drift. And exiting the drift is a matter of letting off the throttle or beginning to reel in your steering, but instead of leaving the steering countersteered such that it whips the car in the other direction, you pull the steering back. So like, for example, we're in drift right here, we're going to do a transition, we're in drift right here, and let's say we want to stop on this straightaway, we're just going to unwind the wheel as we let off the throttle. You want to be really careful, especially if you're drifting in real life, about letting off the throttle without changing your steering, because typically that's a recipe for a transition, and a lot of people die, not really die, but a lot of people total their cars and have a really bad event because they let off the throttle at a bad time, and it causes the car to whip into the outside wall that they were trying to drive away from, or drive near to, but not actually into. So you got to be careful about that. Now let's actually do a few transitions and then talk about some specific strategies to control your weight shift to your advantage so that you don't spin out. So we're going to throw the car in, wait, catch the drift with throttle, and then we can drive around the track. For this example, I'm going to use the throttle liftoff method. And you can watch my pedal cam there and see very clearly that I'm pretty much just letting off throttle and then getting back on when the car is done picking up angle. If you are spinning in transition, there's a couple of possibilities. It could be that your countersteer angle or the speed that you're countersteering is too slow or too low. Could also be that you are staying on power too long. Again, the throttle and the steering
are always linked. What you do to one impacts what you need to do to the other, unless you want to cause a transition to happen. And once you are causing a transition to happen, it's also going to be the same story for catching your drift and keeping the car from spinning out. Now, the next thing to consider is the way that transitions tend to work. If you transition with a small amount of angle, like before you start your transition, if you're at kind of a shallow angle, odds are the car is going to transition to a shallow amount of angle. On the other hand, if you are at a whole lot of angle, it is probable that the car is going to transition to a whole lot of angle. And that could be your problem. You could be spinning because you're queuing up way too much angle. This is actually what is at play when you're trying to throw a backwards entry or a 360 entry. You're essentially queuing up so much angle before you make that transition that it causes the car to go super wide into a backy, or if you adjust your countersteer a little bit, straight up into a gangster 360 entry. So look at that. If you're having trouble spinning out, you very well could be on the lock stops before the transition. Like if you're here, full on the lock stops, and then you do your transition, it's going to be hard not to go super far out. So you can consider adjusting how you're driving to cause the car to not be quite as sideways before your transition. It'll help out. Another thing that you can consider doing is use the lift-off throttle technique that I talked about. One of the essential truisms of drifting, which is so important to know and just to keep in mind, is that the faster the car is going, the less time you have to give it the correct inputs to stay in drift and keep from spinning out. The slower the car is going, the more time you'll have. And in the same type of way, the faster the car is changing angle and it's picking up angle. So like if you like drifters who have really sharp, snappy max angle to max angle transitions, that is harder. They have less time to complete the steering inputs and the throttle inputs that are required than somebody who kind of gracefully floats the car in the turns. So you could consider using the lift-off throttle method, which will take a little bit longer for the car to transition, and it'll lead to a little bit easier time going around the track. A third thing that you can try, and this is sort of my secret weapon for people that are having a tough time getting drifting transitions figured out, is actually apply a little bit of deceleration force when the car is facing straight ahead. Now this I actually have to show you with a visual aid here. So check this out. This is your car, right? You're in grip if you're facing this way. Here's your drifting. So you're going to be transitioning from here to here, right? So let's say that you're drifting in this direction. You start your transition. Give the car a little bit of either foot brake or, if you prefer, e-brake right here when the car is facing dead ahead as it's transitioning past. Just go boop right there. You don't have to give it a lot. I'm talking somewhere between like 10% and no more than maybe 50% throttle. Experiment with it and you'll figure it out. But essentially what that's going to do is the first half of your transition is normal. When you hit the brakes right there, it causes everything A, to slow down, which for the second half of that transition gives you more time, but B, it also kind of interrupts the car's flow from going from big angle to big angle, and it's going to make it, for that second half of the transition, have a weaker rate of angle change. Again, the slower that it's changing angle, the more time that you have to get the job done. I find that this is really helpful. Personally, I like to do it with the foot brake, which we're going to go demonstrate now, because it's a little bit more subtle and it's not so obvious. I feel like people who use the e-brake to do it, while it still can achieve the same result, end up, it's just really obvious that you're doing it, and I don't think it looks all that great. It looks like you're trying a lot harder than somebody who's just breathing onto the foot brake. Let's go demonstrate that. So we can do it right from the start here, but I'm going to do a Manji entry. Okay, now we are in, and we're going to do it right here. Watch my foot. Boop. Boop. See, I'm just giving it a little bit of brake. Now, if you give it a lot of brake, it'll almost stop the car from drifting. You see how quickly the car just like got really tame and under control? So you have to control how much you're doing. but this is a great thing to do, especially if you accidentally find yourself at baller angle. You can keep the car under control. Now, depending on when you do it, you may also find that the car is going to come up short because it does slow you down. So if you transition at the normal time and you give a pretty solid amount of brake, this is why I say only give it like 10 or 15% sometimes, you might find that the car is no longer going to make it around the turn. It'll be all up on the inside curbing. But that little bit of foot brake will really help you out if you are just loading up the car massively. So I'm going to load up the car massively here, big angle. In this case, it wasn't enough, but you get the idea. Experiment with that. I really think that that can help you guys out. There could be one final reason that you're having so much difficulty with the car spinning in transition. And I kind of hate to say it, but it's got to be said. It very well could be the actual sim racing hardware that you're using, the wheel itself. Now, this is not a segue into any sort of sim gear elitism. Here's the basics if you're not really familiar. There are different types of motor configurations in sim driving wheels. Going in the order of least expensive to most expensive, there are gear-driven units, which is basically everything by Logitech. There are belt-driven units, which tend to be things by Thrustmaster and Fanatic, but there are also gear or gear belt hybrids from Thrustmaster, so you do have to be careful. And then last but not least are direct drive wheels. Quite frankly, some of the gear drive units, well, in my experience, all of the gear drive units are simply not powerful enough to self-steer the wheel. Self-steer is that phenomenon that you see where a driver, when they're in drift, will let go of the wheel, or they'll, in my case, in a more subtle way, let the wheel slip through their fingers like this, and then they'll grab the wheel again. So you can see that in any of my videos, and like I'm doing it right now. When I transition, I let the wheel slide through my hands. I'm not steering the wheel myself, right? In this case, if this is how you're going to drive, and most people drift like this in real life too, you are relying for sim on the electric motor of your wheel being able to spin fast enough to enable this to work. And if your electric motor is not strong enough, you're not going to have a good time when you go to transition. If you try to drive like this, what you're going to find is that the car goes into a slow spin like this. The countersteer is just going to be too slow, and that's going to cause the car to pick up more angle than it can hold and essentially park itself. So you're going to go to max angle and not be able to recover and slide to a stop. My personal opinion on direct drive wheels is that while they are amazing, they are expensive, they are not supported off the shelf by as many games, and at least in drifting, you just saw I don't even steer the car with my hands most of the time. During the entire transition phase, I'm hands off the wheel, and that's how most people do it. So it's only the modulations and the small adjustments in that third phase of drifting where you're maintaining the drift that you're even going to notice and appreciate the wheel's force feedback from like a driving standpoint. So if drifting is your focus and you haven't bought a wheel, I recommend that you buy a belt drive wheel. And I link a bunch of them in the description of basically every one of my videos. They are affiliate links. It doesn't cost you any more, but I get a couple of bucks. Of course, that doesn't help a lot of you. A lot of you guys are using a Logitech wheel because they're more affordable, and most people getting into sim drifting are working with a budget. I know because I used to do that as well. In the closet over here, I've got a Logitech Driving Force from like the PS2 days, and I used it for grip racing. I tried to use it for drift, and it was terrible. Again, I could drift in real life at that point. I wasn't like a tandem superhero, but I could link tracks without any problem. And I tried to sim drift back in the day and live for speed with that wheel. It was no good. It turned me off from trying to sim drift until like last year because I thought, it's not realistic, it's pointless. I feel like I'm having to muscle the gear, like I'm having to overpower the motor instead of the motor working for me. If you are using a Logitech, a few things you need to know. One, you're probably going to have to help the wheel. And when I say help the wheel, I can't demonstrate this super well because, again, I use wheels that self-steer, so I'm not actually very good at doing this. Watch YouTube videos from people with Logitech wheels and you'll see them do it. But let's say that we're drifting. we're going in this direction, we're steering around, you know, the car's coming around like this, okay? So when we want to change directions, we know that the wheel is going to have to spin this way for us to change and face in that direction, right? So instead of doing what I do, where you basically just ease up your grip and let the wheel self-steer on its own using the motor, you're actually going to take whichever hand is in the direction that's going to go from the center out that the wheel needs to rotate, which would be this hand in this case. You're going to take it and you're going to throw the wheel like that, and you're going to help it get started at the start of the transition. It's up to you to time this correctly, but through practice you can figure out what to do, when to do it. You can try using both hands if you want, but the key is you're going to have to throw the wheel to get it started, and then reposition your hands and either finish it or help it more. So I'll attempt to demonstrate that, but it's probably going to go poorly. Like, you throw the wheel like right there, and again, because I don't practice this, it feels super weird for me to do. Throw the wheel right there. Doing that is going to help speed the wheel up, and hopefully it's going to get your countersteer closer to where it needs to be. Combine that with all of the other techniques that I've already covered, it's going to put you in a better spot. Another thing that you can consider for Logitech and for Thrustmaster users, I haven't felt the need to do this with my Fanatic system, is you can install a LUT generator, basically a modifier for how force feedback is handled in the game. I have heard from everyone in my Discord community rocking a Logitech wheel, basically. There are opportunities to actually get better force feedback and better countersteer, self-steer as a result. It won't completely solve the problem, because I promise you're ultimately dealing with a mechanical limitation of the motor that's in your wheel. It's like not having a strong enough graphics card. You can overclock things and, you know, try to eke out more power, but ultimately you would really be in the best situation if you could afford to buy a better card in the first place. If you're running Content Manager and Custom Shaders patch, CSP actually has an extension called FFB Tweak, which you can activate and play with, and you may find superior results there. If you're not into that, or for whatever reason you don't like how that feels, there are also other LUTs that you can install for both Logitech for sure, and I'm pretty sure as well that my Thrustmaster fam has told me that they have had good results with those as well. Here, I'll just turn my wheel off real quick. The nice thing about belt drive wheels is there's zero resistance. I can spin this thing as fast as I want to, and it's just that fast when I'm actually driving as well. Whereas if you had a gear, for whatever reason, the way that those suckers work, you are actively fighting against the gear, and you hear it going like as you're idling the motor and turning it. So that is my last tip, and it's more of a FYI really, but if you're on a Logitech wheel especially and you're struggling, know that it's not necessarily you. It could be that your wheel is just not ideal for what you're trying to do, especially if you drift in real life. It's 100% not your fault. If you can do this in real life, it's definitely that your wheel is too slow, your wheel is letting you down. Install a LUT generator, use the other techniques that I mentioned to control and slow down the rate of that angle gain when you're in transition, and hopefully that will help you out. If you guys want to hang out with me, I have a Discord community. It's linked in the description. I'd be happy to have you in there. We've got over probably 2,500 IRL and sim drifters that are happy to hang with you, as well as give you advice if you're trying to get something figured out for your setup. And additionally, I live stream on Twitch every Friday, plus I'll add additional days. Check the schedule on the Twitch page. That is twitch.tv/KameTrick. I hope to see you guys there. Let me know what else I can do to help you guys out. Have a good one. Peace.